Great. Thank you so much, Brian. Thanks for the warm welcome again. Welcome back to everyone who has already joined us for the first couple of sessions, and also welcome to anyone who's new today. The sessions are recorded. The first two that we did were combined parts 1 and 2, an introduction to local place plans. So now this week we have an opportunity to really dig into the practicalities of what it might take for a community council, for a group of volunteers, to actually lead one of these plans and create them in your own place. As Brian said, this week is an overview of how to deliver and project manage a local place plan. So there are, in fact, there's quite a lot of territory to cover. So we will be rattling through stuff, and there might be a little bit less time for questions at the end this week. So just be aware of that. Anyway, so this is session 3, project managing your local place plan. I'm Paul Eade, and this is Chiara Fingland. I'm director at Place at the Table. Chiara is director at imagineif.space. Place at the Table is able to offer you project management, facilitation, policy services, and also, as a member of the Royal Town Planning Institute, I'm a chartered planner. I can support you with writing the draft plans and also the justifications that the reasoning sections that you might need to write in planning terms. We do data coding, training, mentoring, and mediation. And this is Chiara.
Evening, everyone. And imagine if we do a similar line of work to Paul and work very closely with Paul and Place at the Table around local place plan consultancy, particularly around community engagement, briefing development for projects, but also right through things like project coordination and delivery. So hopefully things beyond the generation of the place plan as well. Thanks, Paul. So these training sessions have covered a whole lot of ground so far by way of introduction, but this training session is the first one where we kind of get into the teeth a little bit more of a particular topic. And the first topic of this, or which this training session covers, is project managing your local place plan. So as Paul's indicated, it's going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour because there's quite a lot to get through, but certainly the subsequent 4, 5 and 6 will go into depth in some of the stages that will not have sufficient time to cover in detail tonight, but really hopefully it'll give you a good idea around what we mean by project managing the place plan, and most importantly some useful hints and tips that we've picked up along the way, having been involved in several of these over the course of the past few years. So next slide, thanks. So we like to summarise it as a sort of a 6-step journey in the process of generating your local place plan. So that's everything from the foundations phase, which we touched on a little bit in the last 2 sessions, but we're going to speak a little bit more about tonight. Then on to engagement, so that's you engaging with your wider community. And again, in particular, we're going to touch on that in more depth during next week's session, which is around designing your engagement strategy. We then go into the analysis phase, so that's pulling back in all of this information that you've galvanized from your community and also through the steering group process. And then going on to stage 4, which is around developing your draft plan. So that's having taken all of the data, analysed it all, and actually thinking about, okay, well, what are the themes that are coming through and the proposals that might be generated off the back of that? Then we're on to milestone 5, which is around the information notice period. And again, Paul's going to discuss that later on in tonight's training about what that involves before submitting it to the local authority to be validated. So yeah, I think some questions that you might have to begin with could be like, how do we start in the best way possible? What kind of time frame do we need for this plan? I think the time frame thing's a really interesting kind of question and one we get asked a lot. How can we ensure that we don't get sidetracked? Another one, because it's quite easy to go down rabbit holes in all things place plan related, because there's kind of so much to cover. But also, how do we make sure that we have a valid submission at the end? So we don't want people and groups to be putting in all of this work and then right at the end coming up against a hurdle or a barrier which might make submission not possible or delay it. So really this session is going to focus on stages 1 and 4 to 6 of that time kind of milestone timeline that I showed in the previous slide, and stages 2 and 3, which is the engagement and the analysis, will have dedicated sessions over the next 2 weeks on those. And And really, we're going to be sharing tips from our own practice. So steal what works for you, but also please change what doesn't. There's no silver bullet to these processes, and we're continuing to learn. But what we hopefully will share tonight is just some of those learnings that we've had so far. Next slide, thanks, Paul. So yeah, firstly, foundations. So what do we mean by that? That's the sort of baseline, really trying to get organised right at the beginning. And that's really important to kind of get you off to a good start. So when we ask the question, how do you start in the best possible way? Try and get as organised as you can. And Planning Aid Scotland have a really useful tool, which Paul and I recommend to groups whenever we're getting started, which is their project management tool. And really this does what it says on the tin. It's a simple framework that can help you plan your process. And again, there'll be bits in it that might seem over the top with your context, or equally there might be bits that you're like, oh, I hadn't thought of that. So that's really useful to think about. But what that does is it sets out exactly the kind of key steps that you need to think about at the beginning. So whether that's things around boundaries or key roles, right down to things around mapping skills in your community as well, because we know these processes are often volunteer-led, and what can be really helpful is really understanding and getting to know that your group that you're working with and all of the different skills that they might have, because that's kind of what carries it. It's not just down to one person with one particular skill. You kind of need a whole cocktail of things when you're doing a place plan. So yeah, I would really kind of advocate for you to have a look at this tool, and we can pop a link into the chat later on, just so you can have a look. But again, there'll be links embedded in the slides. So next slide, thanks, Paul. So a few key elements to establish in this foundations phase. So firstly, a mandate. Secondly, roles. Thirdly, scope. And fourth, process. So these are the ones we're going to touch on this evening. Next slide, thanks, Paul. But one further question that we quite often get asked is, what's the minimum consultation required for a local place plan? And really that's a kind of interesting question in the fact that the kind of circular, if anyone's read it in great detail, doesn't stipulate an exact minimum. And what it does state is, it's important to basically set out how you bring voices in from the community, who is affected by the proposals, and the methods that you carry that out. So there is technically no minimum, but there's certainly some good practice and ways to go about it. And you do have to have a community support planning statement within your plan, which again we'll talk about in a little bit more detail in next week's session, but also through tonight's presentation. So a little question just to kind of keep in your mind. So firstly, going back to the sort of ABCD, so we've got first up, mandate. So we did the best we can with the resources we had. And I think Paul and I would both say that's a really important kind of little statement to almost like keep going back to, because I think all of us who are involved in this line of work in terms of community-led plans and strategies and project delivery all want to be doing the best we possibly can, but also we've got to really manage expectations in terms of what capacity is actually available as well. So we really need to be mindful of things like time, people's energy as well, and the people we're working with too, because everyone is coming from a slightly different position and background and context. Also skills, as I mentioned previously in that project management tool, really get to know your group and really get, everyone brings something different to the table, and that's what's really nice about these processes, certainly having been involved with it, whether it's someone's got a particular preference for like illustration or photography, or someone's really into just actually hosting people at these engagement events, or there's kind of something for everyone to get involved with, so that's really nice to try and do up front. And another thing to be mindful of is around funds. So again, we'll maybe touch on this a bit more in the Q&A, but thinking about what finance you might need to do this plan, and we've seen it done on an absolute shoestring, so it is completely possible, but all of these 1 to 5, it's about balancing them all off, because if you don't necessarily have big funds to get external support in, that will require more time and energy from volunteers, so it's just about getting to know your group and managing that expectation up front. Next slide, thanks, Paul. So a few top tips coming off the back of that is demonstrating as comprehensive a mandate as possible. And really that's showing a sort of united front to the wider community in terms of you're kind of taking ownership of taking this on, but you're very keen to hear their views. Connecting with key groups locally is really, really powerful as well. So thinking about who locally you can get involved, because the broader the sort of representation you have involved, again, it goes back to the mandate thing. It really kind of builds on the legitimacy of your plan. Also thinking around connecting with people at the edges, so those that are maybe it says powerless in terms of maybe they don't have as much of a voice. And again, these are going to be questions that we delve a little bit deeper in next week in the designing of the engagement strategy. But also having multiple opportunities to engage is really important as well. So again, we come back to this phrase, there's no silver bullet. It's really important to think about how we outreach to people. So whether that is them coming to you or you going to them, it's finding that sort of balance. And we've got a few useful tools to think that through as well that we can share. Early involvement with council officers is also really helpful. So that can be potentially an assigned planning officer who deals with the local place plan side of things. So we would kind of advocate for you to try and reach out to them. And most local authorities have a sort of information email address that you can contact. And we'd recommend that just to start that dialogue. Also involving elected members can be really helpful in terms of continuing to share and understand what you as a local community are looking to do. And finally, carry landowners with you. So this is always can be a challenging dynamic in some instances, but actually having them involved and round the table is really good to have that early dialogue. So when you're starting out a process, it's always kind of good practice to make them aware that you're going to be taking this process on and finding out, you know, what their thoughts are and how they may be involved. Next slide, thanks, Paul. An elected member briefing is also a helpful thing to do in terms of establishing those kind of delivery champions and also speaking to them early to build trust between parties is really important as well. So that goes from a councillor to community context, but also vice versa. So really just kind of building that two-way feedback loop and flow. You can do that in things like an online chat for them only, just to create that safer space, but also explain the aspirations and what you're trying to do through the plan too. And having time to ask questions is also really helpful. And Paul, was there anything else you wanted to share on this particular point?
No. The main thing is to try and get your elected members involved as early as possible. I'm working in Jura at the moment, and one of their councillors actually joined one of our first sessions. That's because at the back end of the process, they're going to be key people that you want to help you deliver on the plan that you've created and be able to network and help corporately to make sure stuff comes together. So involve them as early as possible is my recommendation.
Yeah, and as well, just speaking from some experience as well, they're often at some community council meetings and things. So if you've already got an established relationship, that's great. But if not, it is good to involve them, as Paul said, right up front in the process. Okay, next slide. Thanks, Paul. So moving on to roles then, so thinking about your steering group and who's on it. Again, having a representation across community groups with key community connectors can be really helpful. So really thinking about how you can get that representation to reach a wide range and audience within the community. As I think we touched on last week, we recommend between kind of 6 and 8 people, and that's like enough people to help carry the process, but also not too many cooks. It's finding that balance. And also recognizing representation that's like has that credible mandate, coming to that point of if you've got people that are involved in different groups, then there's not necessarily a view that any one particular group's pushing a particular agenda. You just are able to kind of build that kind of consensus around what's been put forward. And then also Paul's got a really good sort of classification system of remainers, relocators and returners. So I'll pass back to him to chat you that through.
Just a caution, it's not to really classify people. It's just a lens that I often use to understand how people within a community bring different perspectives and gifts at any given moment, and also to read your community and understand where some of the dynamics are coming from. So the words explain themselves, but Remainers are folks who have been in a community for a really long time, even been born there, understand it inside out, know what the story is, who's related to who's fallen out with who. Those insights can be really, really powerful. Then there's folks who've relocated to your community, who might be newer, who didn't grow up there, but maybe bring a fresh outside perspective. And there's returners, so that's people who have gone away from the community, maybe as after they've grown up there, gone away, been elsewhere for work or study, and then come back, maybe to have a family, these kind of things, and they bring their own unique perspective. Often, what they're able to do is little Johnny, he grew up here. Well, he's legitimate. He understands what's going on. But then little Johnny also has grown up and he's got some other ideas from outside. These returners can often mediate between these perspectives. And we see these fault lines sometimes in communities, say in the Highlands or more rural areas, particularly around, for example, housing. So often there's a little bit of tension around housing and relocators buying homes, things like that. Whereas folks who are living locally are looking to find properties for their family. But altogether, actually, affordable housing is going to meet everybody's needs. So just be aware of those kind of roles, the fault lines in your community, but try and get a steering group that's representative of all those positions so that you can get a balanced understanding as you run the process as to how to meet everybody's needs.
Great, thanks, Paul. And so this is just a kind of helpful little table that kind of begins to consider some of the roles that you kind of need to undertake within the steering group. So there's obviously the steering group membership. So that's like a group of local people, you know, potentially office bearers in the community council or charities to lead and oversee the place plan. You've then got the sort of administrative side, so that's kind of general organisation stuff, correspondence, record keeping, minutes, things like that. Fundraising is also quite a key role, particularly if you're wanting to think about support around some of that, but also thinking about projects ongoing as well. Communications is an absolutely critical one, because you could be doing the best work in the world as a steering group, but unless you're able to kind of communicate more widely, that's going to be a really kind of difficult process to kind of get that representative view within your place plans. So that can, and again, comes back to that there's no one single way of doing that, unfortunately. So that's everything from social media to writing letters or emails, to also just like word of mouth, so getting out there in person, but also potentially some media inquiries as well. You've then got things like volunteer coordination. So that's thinking about particularly around engagement events, you know, who's helping to host those, just coming up with that task delegation. And then we've got things like design and graphic support. So that could be like visuals for your place plan. It could be promotional graphics like posters, right through to graphic support for your actual plan itself. There's also event and discussion facilitation, so helping to coordinate those group discussions, run events, and again, coming back to that sort of task delegation side of things. And then there's the actual analysis and the plan writing. So some people, you know, we've seen in the steering groups where we've had a steering group that's had someone who's particularly, like, she's a researcher by background, so she was really comfortable with a sort of data analysis process. So that was really useful, whereas others felt more confident to actually begin to host the events and do that task delegation. And then others, it's maybe the graphic side of things. So as I kind of mentioned before, there's usually something for everyone to get involved with, but it's just trying to make sure you kind of got someone to try and cover some of the gaps. And if you can't cover the gaps, looking at what you can do to help plug those holes. So next slide, thanks, Paul. So yeah, thirdly, scope. I think when we've been doing place plans and just observing kind of what happens, it can be quite easy to, I think when you get involved in all of the detail and you're asking people about what they want to change in their place, it can be quite easy to go into like hyper detail mode and try and feel like you need to work through a whole feasibility just to put something in your local place plan. But I think what we kind of wanted to get through this slide was really about a point to kind of zoom out a little bit. The local place plan is really about establishing hooks that you can then further develop, you know, proposals into projects beyond that. So I guess this was just a kind of prompt to caution against too much detail. There's finding a right balance around articulating a proposal that's got a justification that's stemmed through evidence within the engagement process, but not feeling like you need to carry the world with it and having everything worked out, because that will kind of develop and evolve and be part of a dialogue with a much wider range of stakeholders, most likely as well. So really this is just a kind of point to be like, it's okay to zoom out a little bit. And that's also something that For the majority of people, there maybe haven't been involved with that side of things as well. So it can be a sort of a learning curve in itself to really think about. Next slide, thanks, Paul. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we want to make sure that the process will make sure you deliver on validation requirements at the end. So as I say, we want to make sure all of this good work doesn't get stifled at the end by forgetting to do something up front. So this checklist, which again is in some of the Planning Aid Scotland guidance documents, is really helpful just to kind of come back to just work through it. And it's almost useful just to have it kind of in the background as you're kind of working through your plan, just to make sure you're kind of on track, making sure you've considered different things at different stages. And again, we'll kind of talk some of that through in terms of what you kind of do when, but as I say, it's a really useful reference point to come back to. And another thing just to kind of mention there is things like tracking numbers and dates of your engagements is really important, because that all feeds into your community support statement in your plan as well. Next slide, thanks, Paul. So yeah, in terms of the process, this is just a kind of quick, helpful diagram to think about, the role of the steering group versus the role of the wider community. And I guess the steering group is to do with the process, so trying to have quite a strong mandate as a steering group to be comfortable and taking ownership for that process. But then the content, in terms of what's actually in the plan, is community led. So that's where you get that wider community input, and insight. And I think it's just about having, I suppose, Paul and I would sort of advocate for you as a steering group to feel confident to have that sort of mandate in terms of defining what the process is, particularly if you've got that cross-sector representation in your steering group, and not necessarily having to go back to the community all the time just about the process in of itself, but also what's actually the content. That's the main thing where we want kind of wider community input. Paul, do you want to come in?
Yeah, that's just to say that with the content, just to be aware that as steering group members, you're going to have your own thoughts as residents, but also perhaps you're members of other groups and you've got a sense of accountability to those groups in the community. So you're wearing all these different hats as you sit within a steering group trying to manage this process. And it's legitimate, clearly, as residents to feed content in and to add value to the process. But just be aware of the hats you're wearing and understand that as a steering group member running the process, I would observe that there's a kind of position or a posture of servant leadership that's required that really seeks to understand what the community is really trying to say, and not just bring your perspective into shaping what emerges. And as Kara says, the flip side, I've come across community groups who've been a bit timid and lacked confidence and have thought about that they needed to go back to the community to get their opinions on how the process should work. But that's it's basically really unhelpful. Nobody really wants that. They trust you to take forward the decisions as to how the process happens, and just to lean into that and be confident in it.
Great, thanks, Paul. Pop on to the next slide. So yeah, it's very useful up front to set that timeline. So thinking about, we gauge sort of 6 months as roughly a month for each stage, but as a volunteer group, you may want to plan for more time. So it really is down to your own context as to what feels realistic. And sometimes in terms of defining that timeline, it can be helpful to kind of work backwards from that. So what we've kind of prepared there on the right-hand side of the slide as you view it, you can see some key milestones that have been noted, but kind of in reverse order. So if we start off with the submission deadline, so that's the sort of drop dead date that you need to work to, and then working back from that 2 to 3 weeks for deliberation around tying up any loose ends that have come off the back of that final consultation period. And then 5, you've got your 4-week information notice period. And again, Paul's going to touch on that in a bit later in the training. And then you've got 2 to 3 weeks for proposal formation. So that's you developing your plan. 1 to 2 weeks for analysis, and then an amount of time for engagement. And that's probably the one where we see the most variation, I would say, across kind of community groups, because that is subject to the steering group's capacity, but also the community's capacity, more widely in terms of what else is going on. Is there actually just lots of other stuff that's competing, or actually is it in a time where there are moments to engage meaningfully? And also then coming right back to number one, which is defining a launch day. So we find that's a really helpful piece to just get it on people's radar, and that then sets you off in a good kind of more positive direction when you go out and engage with people. There's been that initial launch, people kind of know about it, it's on the radar, and that then allows you to feed in more of your kind of strategic engagement beyond that. So you can see there, it's kind of helpful to almost start from where you kind of need to have it submitted, and work your way back. And again, there'll be things that push and pull that program, but really what we'd recommend is having that in place really helps you kind of stay on track. So coming back to that question about how do I stay on track, having this and trying to stick to it and reference it in all steering group meetings can be very helpful for that. Next slide, thanks, Paul. So yeah, that comes back to programs. You don't need to do anything fancy. It can be a simple table. Obviously, the one at the bottom there is a bit more sophisticated, but it could also just be a really simple timeline, even with like circles and dates. There's no necessarily right or wrong way to do it. All we would just recommend is that you continually check in on that, particularly at steering group meetings, that you kind of maintain, are we on track? Do we actually need to give ourselves a bit more time? What does that then mean if we give ourselves more time? How does that knock on the program? Does that mean we'll still hit the dates we need to hit? And things like that. So again, just reach out to us if you need to think about that in more detail. But that's just to kind of give you a flavour of what we mean by kind of programs. Next slide, thanks, Paul. But yeah, this is all about a change management process. And yeah, Paul, I'll pass back to yourself to chat through this slide.
So my take on all of this is that what we're trying to do with a community action plan or local place plan is think in the round on behalf of the whole community about what changes we want to see happen over a given period of time, 5 years, 10 years. Now, we're not actually delivering change at this point, but we are designing what the change process may look like. And change gives us hope, gives us opportunities, but it also brings anxieties. So even if we're thinking about maybe taking over the local public toilet that's currently run by the council, somebody's working to clean that toilet, may be locally employed. So if you start talking about taking that over as a community group, there are implications for people. Anxieties are going to surface. The big question is, how do we ensure that we're building trust behind the scenes, because trust and relationship are the currencies for delivery and taking people forward with us. So how do we manage the tension between community anxiety and community trust? Here is a diagram that I find helpful to explain this. So we, as the leaders, we can maybe think of ourselves as innovators. So we're right at the front end of the curve of thinking about change. We kind of have a bit more understanding of where we're trying to get to, and then we're trying to lead the community into what's going on. Most people in the community will find out a bit further on from us that things are going to be discussed and talked about in these plans. And these are called the early majority and late majority in this particular diagram. And it's a lot of the community would fall into that bracket. And then there's potentially also, in any change management process, there's folks that either feel really cynical, they've seen it all, been there, done it before, or possibly even might actively resist what you're trying to do. So the trick that this diagram is trying to say is that if you find folks that are cynical or non-engaging, or even actively trying to resist what you're trying to do for whatever reason, the recommendation I have is to spend time with them and show that you value them on a personal level. Listen to their stories and possibly see if they might shift, but don't spend too much time with them. The reason for that is that we need to put our limited energies into finding ways to enabling the majority of the community to get involved. And that would be my recommendation, is focus on that group, the early and late majority. Now, in order to root any anxieties that do emerge and to sort of take care of that, what we try and do is identify early a wider group of maybe 20 to 30 other people in the community who may be leaders or may just be incredibly well connected, trusted, and liked, to bring on board as early adopters behind us now, and to have a session with them to explain what's going on, have a chance for them to answer questions. And what will then happen is that when wider people in the community see what's going on and have questions, who will they turn to? Will they come to you? Possibly not, actually. They might just go to other people that they trust and say, well, what's going on here? Of course, they're already on board and can help assuage fears and explain what's going on. So find those early adopters and try and bring them on board and gradually widen the circle of influence and understanding as the process continues. And hopefully that will take care of some of the anxieties and maintain your energy in the right direction.
Great, thanks, Paul. Next slide. So yeah, to sum it up, we need to be relational before we get solutional. So yeah, hopefully that kind of brings us to an end of the foundations phase. The next up's engagement. So as I mentioned, we're just going to really kind of quickly skip through this just in the interest of time because we're going to touch on it next week. So there's a slide there that's on marketing. Again, just in the interest of time, I'm not going to kind of run through it line by line, but the key thing is there's some really important considerations to think about, such as your launch date having a few weeks in advance, things around getting your marketing ready for that, and also, you know, how do you outreach, you know, in a physical way and also in a sort of social media, online presence. It kind of all needs to kind of be done. So thinking about how you can do that strategically. Next slide, thanks, Paul. Yeah, listening well to interesting people about stuff that matters. So that stuff is really things that we're going to be talking about in more detail next week. So that's just to flag that'll be next week's session around designing an engagement strategy for your local place plan. Next, thanks, Paul. And then similarly, in an analysis point of view, next slide, thanks. As you can see depicted on this image on the right-hand side there, you go out, you get all of this amazing information. As shown in the image, it's often very colourful in lots of different themes, lots of different things are covered. And actually there's a process of sorting that just to begin with before you've even thought about arranging it. So there's the sorting process, arranging process, and then you work out with, once you've kind of arranged it in some form of workable manner, you can then think about, okay, well, how am I going to play some of that back? And how am I going to synthesize that to, you know, show what emerging themes have come out of the data? And really all of this needs explained with a story, but we're going to cover that in a lot more detail in the session on the 12th of March, which is around processing the data you gather from your local place plan. So I'll leave you with that as a teaser, and I'm going to hand over to Paul for stage 4.
Okay, still with us, hanging in there? Remember, this is getting recorded. If it's going a bit too quick, you'll be able to replay this at your leisure. Deep breath. Ooh, different presenter. Okay, stage 4. We'll look at stages 2 and 3 the next couple of weeks. Developing our draft. Okay, let's just imagine that we've got to the point where we've done our engagement, we've thought through our data, and we've had a chance to lay it out in such a way that it's easy for us as a steering group to access what's that's actually saying. There's going to be a lot of different ideas. There's going to be an increasing clarity about the strength of feeling around those ideas. But how do we take those ideas and develop them into proposals within a plan? Now, that's partly about how do we draw the maps. And as we mentioned last week, there's a session that you can listen to that we've popped in a link around how to use maps for your plans. But it's also about understanding the actual nature of the proposals that you want to create and collaborating to develop those proposals. A lot of groups find this stage a little bit daunting when they come to it, because it's not clear how necessarily to work as a group together to come up with the best proposals that we can. So here's some tips. Remember, first of all, that we need to come up with this, what's known as a spatial vision. So we need to come up with an overall map of our chosen area, which makes clear where the different proposals are going to be. And that ultimately, what we're trying to do with each proposal is something that could be as simple as this, which is lay out a vision for a particular project, on a site, and then explain what we want to see happen in planning terms, what the proposal is for that actual site. So if it's a community garden we want to build, then maybe we want to argue in our local place plan proposal for a change of use on that site, justified by policy 9 brownfield and policy 25 community wealth building. So that we're trying to get from data and ideas to some kind of crystallized proposal for each thing that we want to put forward to the council. So here's just an example of the type of thing that I do. I use a Word document. I sit down with the steering group, and usually what we find is to delegate one person to sort through the data initially and to come up with some ideas for proposals themselves. So that's quite an important role potentially. But what's so good about that is if someone is able to do this, that's trusted by the group, just to do this first round, what you can then do is have a conversation over some concrete proposals that you can then amend and shift. Whereas working together straight off with a blank sheet and the data can actually be more tricky. So our recommendation is always to find a volunteer within your group to give it a bash. To give it a bash first of all, to come together after that's been done with a group of maps, maybe just lying around a table, and start working together over some actual content in front of you on the table that you're sitting around. So that doesn't have to be as detailed as this. It could be as simple as a headline as to what we want to see happen for a particular thing, and then some details about what we already know about what's going on and why people have said this. So if you're coming to the table with a list of perhaps 8 or 9 initial proposals that someone's in your group's already sort of hashed out, then it becomes a bit easier to talk about. So you can work through the first proposal as a group sitting around the table. And what I do is I use a simple tool for building consensus. We can't build consensus with our entire community, even a community of 300 people. It's just not possible. That's why it's the community body that has the authority to put together these plans. Ultimately, there has to be a representative aspect to this. We can listen well, we can check in with the community, but our group, ultimately, the one that is representing the community body, has to make some decisions. But the way to do that, the way I do that, is I'll put forward the draft proposal, this particular thing we want to talk about for a community garden, and then I'll do a little check-in. I'll go around the whole group and I'll say, just to see where people are at with this right now that you've read it, what do you think about it? On a scale of 1 to 5, using our fingers. Pause, make sure that everyone's had a think about that, and then invite them on a count of 3 to reveal at the same time what their feelings are. So 5 people might hold up 5 fingers, 2 might hold up just 2 fingers, but make sure you get that the right way around. And then someone might be on a 1. And so what we're doing is revealing. 1 is I feel so uncomfortable with this proposal, I wouldn't want it to go ahead. 5 is I'm just completely enthusiastic. With initial check-in, what you're doing is you're getting a sense of where everyone's at, and we're not guessing what people are really thinking from the off. And it also, what that does is you can then interrogate each person and go, well, invite them to share. Well, why are they feeling that way? What's good about this? First of all, it doesn't close the conversation down, it opens it up. Secondly, you do it by revealing at the same time, everyone's sharing what they really think and not anticipating what everyone else might be thinking. And thirdly, you could, with each proposal, it could be that everyone sits around the table straight away and goes 1. All right, well, we're not going to include that then. There's just no conviction on the group for this. Or everyone might be holding up 4 or 5 fingers. And you're like, okay, initially, before we put any detail on it, we can just go ahead with this. So we work through these almost like a painting. We're just blocking in colors initially, and we work through carefully, or we're not just at a higher level. If there's difference, the finger vote reveals that difference. So you can then say, okay, if that person, you're holding up 2 fingers, what why don't you think that proposal is workable? Why don't you think it should be into the plan? And then you also most critically ask, what would change if we change something in this? What would we change to get you to a 4 or a 5? So you're creating the ability for people to say what they think is wrong, but then inviting how to change that in a positive direction. And so you go around the group and you allow people to share on that basis, work up some changes to the initial draft proposal until you've all come to a conviction where you think, yeah, this could fly, or ultimately maybe not. And then finally, what I do is I do a little check-in again, and I say, well, where are we at just now on a scale of 1 to 5? And usually what happens is we've got to the point where either the proposal shouldn't go in or everybody's going 4 or 5. And I go, okay, well, let's move on to the next proposal now. This really helps to create a context for shared ownership and building great ideas and different perspectives into making sure the proposal it can be as good as it can be. So then you'd work through all your proposals and come together with a conviction as a group as to the big blocked in colours of your painting. Then you might be able to go into a little bit more detail and ask someone to think about, well, what would be the connections? Well, how would you justify this proposal? What reasoning would you give in planning terms? So this little table here just gives you it shows that this is a core bit of the validation requirements for submitting your plan, to be able to show how your ideas link to the other policy frameworks that control your place, the local development plan and national planning framework 4. Now, we're going to go into that more in the last session that we run for you. But that once you've got a proposal, you can then think about, well, how does this relate to other plans, and start explaining your justification. So this is where you could end up explaining from different policies and justifying with conviction why you think it's a good idea. And the goal here is actually, a good submission to the local authority where you're saying these are the reasons why we think this proposal should go into the local development plan, has good justification, and makes it harder, if you like, for the local authority planners to refuse your proposal by explaining really clearly why it's acceptable. And that's what planning is often, is arguing your case. So we'll go into that more in a few sessions' time. A template structure for your report. We put all the explanatory stuff at the beginning, who you are, who's endorsed the plan, a little introduction explaining what's going on. You might put in a bit of context about your community, some data and some history, a list of your local place plan proposals numbered off with a map at the beginning showing exactly where those numbered proposals are in your area. And each proposal could have a little clearer map for itself, just explaining the spatial element. Then we do a chapter of where we comply with the statements required to show how the proposals relate to your plan. And then we put everything else into the appendices, like we provide a validation checklist and explain really clearly to the planners how you've met all the validation criteria. And you can also throw in additional documents. Top tips: do the best with the knowledge that you have. Have one person draw up the draft once you've got the data to start the process going, but not have the final word. When you get to justifying your statements, I literally sit with the proposals next to NPF 4 as a document, and I just scroll through NPF 4 and I go, okay, that policy might speak to it, or that policy may say something that contradicts it. What do I want to say about that? And how do I want to write that up? You don't have to get everything perfect. You might be uncertain what a community might think about a particular proposal. Your steering group might have an insight. You don't have to just put in proposals that have come to you through the consultation. People might have forgotten, or not the right people have been at the table, and your steering group, who knows your community really well, can at this point go, okay, well, actually, we think that this particular idea might be particularly beneficial. Just throw that in. That's okay to do it at that point. but then use the information notice period to test ideas. So when you go out to the consultation, you can go, well, I'll explain in a minute, but you can go wide to your community. You can go beyond the requirement, the strict requirement of the circular, and you can go back to your community and say, well, what do you think? And you can test the waters again and find out for any given proposal whether there's any conviction or strength of opinion around that. And if it's really clear during the information notice period when you get the data back that a particular proposal just isn't acceptable or it's just too hot potato, after the information notice period, you just pull it from the plan before you finally submit, or you amend it to meet the needs of everyone that's commented. So you can actually use your information notice period to test ideas because it's not the final point. You can certainly amend and remove proposals. However, I wouldn't use an information notice period if you get comments saying, well, what about another proposal or another idea? I would say up front, look, we can't take new ideas at this stage. We have to bring it down to a landing. If we add new ideas, we're going to have to probably, with integrity, go back out again to do the information notice period. And that's, well, you could do that, I suppose, but it's going to take another 28 days. So remove or amend after the information notice period. What is this information notice period? Well, before you get there, before you go out for this formal 28-day period, you might just want to consider doing one final consultation on your draft plan, just to get some insights and inputs and anticipate the need. Maybe there are new ideas that still need to get in. You don't have to do that, but it's just a question for you to ask. But the actual statutory information notice period, it needs to be a minimum of 28 days. It could be longer if your community body so desires. You should follow the guidance. So just reread the relevant sections in the local place plan circular. We recommend that you use what you have to do basically is send a copy of your plan and an invitation to make representations on that plan to each of your ward councillors and to every community council that surrounds your particular area, and give them 28 days to comment on your plan, to make representations on it that you can then take into account and adjust. We always use that period to go further and also ask the community again what they think. You don't have to, however, strictly speaking. But to do this, you have to send out a particular a letter with the information that's required, and there's some guidance in the circular that says what you need to do, or you can use a template document. During this period, though, in addition to going to a wider community consultation, like they've done in Stobswell and Dundee, what we also do is the draft plan is going to be public. So why don't you send that to the council officers anyway? Give them a heads up as to where your draft is at. They might have the time to also come back to you with their ideas and their steers and just give you some extra input before you work on your final draft. So templates do exist. I recommend and use the template that was created by Scottish Borders Council. So if you Google information notice template, Scottish Borders Council, there's draft text for the letter you would send to your councillors and the letter you would send to surrounding community councils. And you're obliged to email them that letter or post it even. You're not obliged, you don't have to get a response. You just have to save that email you've sent so that it's available for evidence should it be required that you show that. And then what you have to do before you submit your plan is just show who you've sent it to, when, that you've complied with the necessaries, and that you can even put in a copy of the letters you sent out to show that you've done so. If you do decide to go wide to the community for consultation, we use Google Forms. We set up a survey that allows communities to, members of the community and community groups, to tick a box saying whether you're an individual or a local community group member or a councillor or a wider community council from around your area. And then we allow them to comment. We do a question for each proposal and we say, what's your position? Object, support, or neutral, and why do you think that, or how would you like to see this proposal changed? But we limit the words for each proposal that anyone can submit to 50 words because you don't want too much data coming back to you. So we just expect people to be concise with what they want to say. So the key thing to be aware of there is you don't want to get loads of data back that you then have to work through. So the more concise people can be, the more helpful it is to you. And then what you can then do is at the end of the information notice period, you look through all of that, you compare that to the plan, you work as a steering group again, perhaps with finger voting, and you just adjust the proposals as you see fit. You don't have to change them at that point, but you might want to because of the consultation. And then what we do is we then just submit all those comments to the authority, whether they agree or disagree with the position that the Community Council has taken. So you're submitting dissenting voices to the final arbiter of the plan, for transparency's sake and to sort of cover your backs with your neighbours. But it gives you the freedom to take a position. So lean into that, and as representatives of the community and the community body itself, take a position on your convictions around these proposals, but then show where people disagreed with you and allow the local authority to take the final decision. And then there's just a slide here. I won't go into detail a bit, but you also need to submit a statement of community support, which is really just an explanation of what you've done to consult the community. As Chiara said, there's no minimum requirement apart from the information notice period. Technically, a community council could just write a plan, go to information notice, and then submit it. Most community councils want to do consultation beforehand. What is required is that you're really clear about what consultation you've done. And that throws that back to you to try and do the best you can to get the best mandate you can from your community, so that when you're walking down the street in 2 years' time and someone comes up to you, a neighbour says, how did you get to that conclusion? You say to them, well, here's what we did, and we did the best we could with the resources we had. And that's all you can say to them, even if they disagreed with the proposal that was put forward and eventually accepted. So, last but not least, you've finally created your final plan. Take some time to then submit it and have a chat with your planning officer at the council before you do. They will be able to give you a steer as to whether you have complied with all the validation requirements, and help you if you haven't. But also remember that even if you submit and you haven't complied with all the validation requirements, that's not the end of the deal. Your council planning officer will just come back to you and say, could you add this or add that? And then we can validate it and put it on file on the register, later assess it. So there was a lot to get through there. We've got 5 or 10 minutes at most left for questions, but that is the end of the presentation. Thank you for your time.